Hello, my name is Mark, and on behalf of Altadena Library District, let me start that again. Hello, my name is Mark, and on behalf of the Altadena Library District, I am here to present The Secret History of Comic Books and Graphic Novels. It's the second in an unofficial series, the first one being The Secret History of Star Wars, which is also available on the Altadena Library District YouTube page, along with all kinds of really cool stuff. So I suggest having a bit of a browse. Here we go. So the Platinum Age is actually a modern term. The Platinum Age takes place before the Golden Age. Sorry, I'm jumping right into it. The Golden Age is when Superman came out. Silver Age is later in the 50s and 60s. Platinum Age is everything before 1938, when Superman comes out, which is the sort of proto-comic books and the prehistory of comic books. And I've taken that super literally, and I've gone all the way back, as you can see, to cave art from the Paleolithic era. I have a little bit of a mistaken caption a little later on. So it's the Paleolithic era, when people are living in caves and hunting and gathering and doing lots of interesting stuff. Here they are hunting animals. So this isn't really a sequential art image per se, which is a sequence of panels depicting some sort of story or interaction where you scan, or time skips ahead in each panel. So this is a sort of example of people doing sort of action art in prehistory. That's from Lascaux, by the way. This image is from Chauvet. It's a cage that was discovered fairly recently. There's the mistakes, not the Neolithic age, it's the Paleolithic age. It's 40,000 years ago. So as you can see, again, there are no panels here, but there's a suggestion that these animals are moving forward. It's a sequence. So we're depicting motion in space-time in a two-dimensional way. So you could say that this is a sort of example of early sequential art, although we're not really obviously in comic book phase because it's a cave wall. There's a great film about the Chauvet cave and all the paintings in there called The Cave of Forgotten Dreams by Werner Herzog. I highly recommend it. It's fascinating. So we're going to jump ahead 39,000 years to the year 1000 AD. This is when the Norman conquest happened. A bunch of people from Normandy came over, and they were sort of fed up with things that were happening in what was sort of proto-Britain. There's a bunch of tribes, and they came over and they conquered Britain. And it's called the Norman Conquest. I think it's 1066. And the Bayeux Tapestry, it was done shortly afterwards. And it's a long, long, long tapestry with different scenes. And as you can see, there's some horse battles going on and archers and cavalry and all sorts of things happening here. And again, this is sequential art. You read it in sequence. Here's something from later in the Bayeux Tapestry. As you can see up there, it's about a guy named Harold, I believe. And I think it's probably the resolution of the story because there's nobody smacking anybody with a staff. It's a bit more peaceful. So Bayeux Tapestry, sequential art, narrative art. We're getting there. Here is something much closer to a comic book. Rodolphe Toffler made these for his children and family. And as you can see, we have the idea of panels now. So this is in the 1830s, early 1830s, and he made quite a few of these. This is one from Monsieur Crepin, which is about a father who gets a bunch of tutors for his kids, and the tutors are all completely eccentric and strange and bizarre, and there's lots of misunderstandings, I assume. Of course, they're in French. Oh no, this one's let's see. I haven't even looked at this one. Looks like it's in English. Amazing. That's something I didn't notice until I hit the record button. Anyway, we have panels and description. We have sequential art. So these were done privately for family and friends. And then Goethe, which is he was a famous German thinker and composer and scientist. He's a man of all trades. Brilliant person. Definitely worth researching him if you're into that sort of thing. But Goethe was a friend and encouraged Rodolphe to publish them. These strips, he'd done these comics, basically, and they were published in the 1870s. Of course, it didn't sort of catch on in any way. They, were just sort of published locally, but they are significant because they're proto comics. Here's an example of comics evolving a little. So before you had sort of words floating in the air describing things or describing dialogue. Here we have word balloons. So it's commentary. So this isn't a sequential image, although it's a sort of image that suggests motion, and then the visual information reveals itself as your eye moves from the left side to the right side. But it is kind of comic book-like in that it has balloons. It's not the first one, but it's just an example I found. I thought was kind of cool. Also shows a bit of the flavor of the very OG satire. It was big in the 1700s and 1800s. This is what you saw in broadsides or pasted to the wall of a tavern or a market, or maybe in a newspaper. This looks tinted, so I don't know where this is published, but that's that's the original equivalent of Saturday Night Live or memes. It was all you had to illustrate it and print it and somehow distribute it. So again, precursors to the comic book era that we know and we're about to get to. So America, Hogan's Alley is a strip that runs in, I think, the New York Herald. And the breakaway hit character is called the Yellow Kid. And the Yellow Kid, as you can see, has things written on his, it's not a nightshirt, but it's just weird outfit he wears. And everything is slightly different. So, you always have to sort of read. Sometimes it's an opinion. Sometimes it's something he's saying. So this is apparently the Yellow Kid, whose name was, what was his name? Mickey Dugan, although he was known as the Yellow Kid. So it was to consider the kind of kid you could see in a big city, in a working class area. He's bald because his head is shaved, because that's what happens if you got lice back in the day. They didn't really have an effective way of getting rid of lice, so they would shave kids' heads. You might notice we're going to reveal his sort of future cousin in a turn of the screen or two, but he sort of inspires a later character. But the Yellow Kid is huge. He actually they start running a strip in another comic, and the strip in another newspaper, and it gives rise to this huge sort of war of newspapers and journalism. And that's actually where the phrase yellow journalism comes from. Yellow journalism is kind of like gossipy and rude and nasty, and it doesn't really have anything to do with the Yellow Kid, other than somehow that's where the phrase came from, the Yellow Kid, which is just a great strip and a fun strip and a cute strip. Here's the Yellow Kid being reprinted way back in the day. So these are kind of like trade paperbacks, when you have a collection of stories like Calvin and Hobbes, we have many in the library, or Peanuts collections, or collections of anything that's sequential art. A lot of comics we have aren't really what they call graphic novels. Graphic novels used to have a very specific meaning, which is one story rather than just 6 issues of Walking Dead or 6 issues of Spider-Man. But the term is used interchangeably, and we'll kind of go into that in a bit. So these are early collections, and they're forerunners of graphic novels. And here we have the Yellow Kid's descendant or cousin. That's Alfred E. Newman from Mad Magazine, who was never really a cartoon character, a character per se. He was always sort of on the cover of Mad, or I don't think they actually did stories with Alfred E. Newman in it, to my knowledge. But they've got the whole, shape of the head, the kind of goofy, kind of holy fool characters, and they're fun. They're cool. So Comic Monthly was 1922, and as you can see, it's square. It's not the shape of a comic book. Of course, now graphic novels come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, but a comic book has a sort of certain dimension. And a lot of trade paperbacks that reprint, again, like The Walking Dead or Batman, are kind of comic book size, basically, the dimensions. But Polyester Pals is more or less square. And Polyester Pals is actually a comic strip. It was very popular. So Comics Monthly reprinted comic strips from the newspapers, and comic strips were huge back in the day, and they were much bigger, and they were given much more attention. Now they kind of shrank them down. They're quite small, but back in the day they gave them a lot of space, and you got several pages of comics in your daily newspaper, and of course the Sunday section too. So this is where the phrase comic books comes from. So this is a collection of comic strips. So it's a book of comic strips, or it's a comic book. It doesn't really sort of catch on, I don't think, the word comic book right away. It's just kind of where you can trace it from. It's where it evolved from. Over on the other side of the screen, you have the funnies, which I think is 1929, at least the first issue. This doesn't have a sort of nice cover like Polly and her pals, well, Comics Monthly, featuring Polly and her pals. They would have, Comics Monthly, just to be clear, would have different, every issue would be a different collection of a different strip. It wasn't always Polly and her pals. So the funnies doesn't have this sort of cover. It's sort of all newsprint, and it's sort of like it's like a newspaper folded in half and stapled. Back in the day, these comic books were actually usually printed by people who owned printing presses, because they wanted to make money, and you didn't necessarily have to be a publisher to make comic books. So it's kind of interesting the way it comes together. And the other interesting thing about the funnies is that it's all new material. None of this is comic strip stuff, because what the distributors or the printers realized is that each page of Comic Monthly, for example, would cost about $10 that you would have to pay to the owner of Polly and her pals to reprint, where they could get people to create original content for $4 a page. So, the way business people are, so eventually they're going to turn 100% towards new content because it's cheaper. Fortunately, it's also kind of cool because you just have more cool stuff in the world, right? So Funnies on Parade is, look at my little sheet here, 1933. This is actually something you had to send away from a big company. But this is the first, many people consider this the first modern comic book because it's the size of modern comic books. This is the first time you've had this particular size, and it's got a glossy cover, and it's sort of specifically designed. It's not like the Funnies, which is some sort of weird folded newspaper thing going on. It's the format that we all know, or that most of us will know, because a lot of people still buy a lot of comic books, obviously, but a lot of people just read graphic novels, which is fine. It's just another format of the same thing. You see Famous Funnies on the other side of the screen. That's 1929, I think. No, 1933. 34, actually. The reason this is in here is because after some issues where it didn't make money, and it caught on. And I think by issue 12, they were making like a $30,000 an issue profit, which back then was a lot of money. That's like probably making $250,000 an issue. So that's a great profit margin. So it caught on, and it made that money because it caught on and sold. But this is when you start getting a comic book put in the newsstand rack alongside famous magazines. So like, hey, this is new, this is different, people are loving it. We're going to elevate it from the bottom row, and we're going to put it up where everyone can see it. So this is where comic books begin to take off, finally. So this comic is from National Comics. This is 1935. And National Comics becomes a very famous comic book company, but they changed their name. That's why you've never heard of National Comics. So this is also, it's a good success. This is when, to differentiate it from some of the other things, this is sort of a company that exists only for making comic books. It's not like printers doing this or whatnot. This is actually a sort of comic book company has come into existence that only does this one thing. So before we get to what happens next, we have to make a detour. Meanwhile, these are pulp magazines. So these would have been, these are from the 20s. So pulp magazines were huge back in the first part of the 20th century, the 1900s. Even up until like the 60s and 70s and 80s, magazines were a really big deal. But before television, magazines were huge. This is where you got, this is where you got your adventure. You could see movies, but actually that was also evolving too. So this was another way of reading, was magazines, and these are called pulp magazines because they were printed on the cheapest possible paper. Most successful magazines were slick, good, nice paper, but pulp magazines were just the worst of the worst, even worse than newsprint. Very disposable, and they were about all kinds of things, but they trended towards adventure stories. So we can see some examples of that there. Suggestion of a fairy tale on the left and pirates on the right. Here we have Black Mask, which eventually becomes just a detective pulp magazine, but here we see it starts early years, it's detective and westerns, and the sort of style of the magazine evolves. It looks a little differently cool later on, but again, Black Mask is a very successful pulp. Weird Tales is quite successful. It's sort of horror and strange stuff. It's where H.P. Lovecraft was published. You can see his name down there in the credits on the left. I love this cover, the ghost table. Apparently this table is just giving off such menacing vibes that a man is pulling a gun on it, and this woman just cannot even. I like it. And I also like Dr. Satan, who is I don't know, maybe he's conjured that money up, or maybe he's a pickpocket. I don't know what Dr. Satan's deal is, but again, an example of weird tales and strange stories. We got another Weird Tales here. It's an early appearance of Conan the Barbarian by Robert E. Howard. Conan the Barbarian has been successful since way back when. Arnold Schwarzenegger that was his breakout role, is playing Conan in the late 70s or early 80s. So that's what put Arnie on the map. And we also see Argosy, another huge magazine. Tarzan, of course, Tarzan is a series of books by Edgar Rice Burroughs, but they also did, the pulp version as well. So I'm not actually sure if they were first published in pulps and then books, or if they were running in parallel. So maybe we'll do a pulp secret history more in depth later. We'll see. Let us know. Write to us, info@altadinalibrary.org. So here's Doc Savage, who's basically Indiana Jones. He's an adventurer. You see him here clinging to the edge of a building, and I assume those people down there are maybe chasing him. I'm not sure. So he's a resourceful man of science, and he good with his fists, and he's just a sort of great sort of heroic character. Massively big success. The Shadow is also huge. The Shadow, I think, starts as a radio serial and then becomes a pulp character. And, these things, they would crank these novels out, and often they would have multiple writers writing under the same name or under somebody's name, like an initial creator. So the Shadow is actually a huge influence on Batman. So he's a denizen of the night. He's got this weird laugh. He's always saying things like, the weed of crime bears bitter fruit. And he also says the shadow knows. And he's very Batman-like. He lurk in the shadow and freak people out with his voice. And Doc Savage is sort of is like Indiana Jones. He's a little bit sort of like Superman, I think, too, because he's got this sort of boyishness to him, but he's not superpowered. Anyway, so the pulps are all of these adventurous characters. New Fun, again, National Comics. National Comics becomes this company. And so this, in 1938, Action Comics comes out. I think it was still National Comics at that point. And Superman is an instant hit. Created by Siegel and Shuster, two working class kids from Cincinnati. And Batman debuts in 1939 in Detective 27, and Batman's creator, Batman's also a massive success instantly. But Bob Kane was a middle-class kid. These are young men. They're not kids. They're 18, 19 years old. And then back in the day, being 18 and 19, you were considered an adult. But they were obviously this guy was listening to his father, and the father said, if you want to sell this character to National Comics, you need a lawyer. And so because he had a lawyer, he got his name on the comic for 80 years, where Siegel and Shuster did not have their name on until recent decades. They had to actually litigate, because they wound up in their 60s in the 1970s. They weren't doing comics anymore. They weren't destitute, but they had really, really difficult lives considering they created a $1 billion franchise already, right? I mean, Superman was mass market, radio shows, movie serials, TV shows, lunchboxes, stationery, everything. It was a massive success. And yet these guys were suffering in their 60s and didn't have any sort of percentage or anything, which is sad. Bob Kane got a better deal, like I said. I put in the other Batman comic because I'm not sure if this is Jerry Robinson or Bill Finger. So Bob Kane actually had a character called Foxman. And there was this amazing dude working at National named Bill Finger. And Bill Finger said, hey, this is really cool, but what if Bruce Wayne wasn't Foxman? What if he was a bat? What if he was Batman? So Bill Finger basically changes the core concept and doesn't get any credit. And then he proceeds to sort of ghost the strip. He's doing it for Bob Kane. And Bill Finger creates Catwoman and Penguin and Joker and the Batcave and just all of the stuff that we think of as the mythos of Batman. But he did it under, I think eventually he did it under his own name, but Bob Kane basically got all the glory. And Bill Finger unfortunately passed away in the 60s or 70s, and he was sort of unsung and on hard times. So it was difficult then, you know. It's comics are still a little difficult now. I mean, you have the people who created Kamala Khan, G. Willow Wilson, and Adrian Afona. You know, they get a credit in the TV show, but all of the people who get this thanks to credit, who created the comics that Marvel uses for their shows, they get like $5,000 because what they do is they sign work for hire contracts. And I actually did a little story for Marvel. So I've seen one of these things. It basically says that we're giving you money once and that's it. We can reprint this forever. We can adapt it into other mediums and you do not get a cent. We own everything you do. And it was much the same way back then. And anyway, that's the setup. That's a sort of ongoing discussion in comics and graphic novels and the comic book industry. I will circle back to it a little later about the business aspects, but suffice to say, these comics are gigantic and instant hits, literally just boom, right away. And National Comics eventually changes its name to DC Comics, which is Detective Comics. So there's a little nugget for you. Meanwhile, across town is a smaller company called Timely Comics. And then they're called Atlas Comics in the 50s. And then they're called Marvel Comics, but then they're called Atlas Comics. And then basically, we're talking about Marvel, obviously, as you can see. Marvel Comics #1, 1939, first appearance of the Human Torch, but this is not Johnny Storm. This is a different Human Torch. And also the Submariners in this first issue. And the Submariner is the first breakaway character that Marvel has. He was a hit, so they gave him his own magazine, as you can see on the right. And sometime later, Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, amazing creators, create Captain America. And here we have Captain America punching Hitler on the first issue's cover, which came out about 4 or 5 months before Pearl Harbor, which is when America entered the war. It wasn't super, it's just, despite what you may think, it wasn't like a super unanimous opinion that Hitler was awful because people didn't really know a lot of what was going on. It wasn't widely reported in the media, and a lot of Americans were so reeling still from the horrors of the Great War, which we now call World War I, that they just did not want another war. So the media was kind of downplaying some of what Hitler was up to. And of course, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby are of the Jewish faith, and they were seeing people, family members, sometimes friends, people in their neighborhoods fleeing from this situation that Hitler created. And so they knew how bad he was. And so it was not necessarily considered cool to criticize Chancellor Hitler, as he was called at the time, but Jack Kirby and Joe Simon knew what was going on. And here is Captain America punching Hitler before the war. So it's kind of a little milestone. Miss America is also a Marvel comic character who's got her own book, and we see her revival character. They reinvented some of the concepts for America Chavez, who you will have seen perhaps in Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. We have some of America Chavez comic books in the adult collection, and they're really, really crazy and cool. I highly recommend them. anyway, so they're not linked. They're only linked just in the sort of titles. There's no connection between the two. Here we have Wiz Comics, which gave rise to Captain Marvel. As you see, Captain Marvel was massively successful. It was like a fantasy strip. So you can see here he's talking to Talkie Tawny, who is sort of eventually becomes his sort of butler. And there's the whole Marvel family happens, Captain Marvel Jr., Mary Marvel, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, there's a big lawsuit because DC sues Fawcett Comics, claiming copyright infringement. Look, Captain Marvel's got black hair, and so does Superman. And they have capes, and they have unitards, or whatever these things are. So unfortunately, the judge at the time ruled against Fawcett, even though a really good case is made, is that, you know, Captain Marvel is a whimsical fantasy character, and Superman is more of a crime fighter, and he's got the science fiction element. You know, it's a different thing. But back in the day, you know, the judge didn't know this. This is part of a evolving pop culture. So unfortunately, Captain Marvel gets taken out of the equation, is not published. The people who sort of own the rights to it lose the trademark. They don't sort of hang on to their rights properly. So in the late 60s, Marvel creates Captain Marvel, who's a Kree warrior and a man, because they won't get sued because there's no trademark for Captain Marvel. And then they've done this, and of course, Captain Marvel is you know, named after Marvel Comics, and eventually that gives rise to Carol Danvers' Captain Marvel. Much later, Carol Danvers is actually in the original Captain Marvel comics for Marvel, Captain Marvel, as he's known. Anyway, DC does manages to buy the trademark for Captain Marvel, manages to buy the trademark for the character, but because Marvel Comics now has a Captain Marvel, they can't call their comics Captain Marvel comics. They have to call the comics Shazam. So that's why Shazam is Shazam. Shazam is the original Captain Marvel. The dude Captain Marvel is Marvel's version, and Carol Danvers is the current version. So all complicated, but it's a shame because Captain Marvel was just wonderful art, and this isn't a good reflection of the art, actually. There's many wonderful artists worked on it, particularly fine illustrators, and it's a shame that it got, they put the kibosh on it, I think, in the 40s or early 50s. Interregnum, that's the period between reigns of kings and queens. And here we have this interregnum. This is sort of the a period between the death of superhero comics and their revival. So after World War II, sales of superhero comics evaporated. All the GIs were into it, and they were reading them. They came home, they just started different things, and even kids stopped reading them. But comics kept going. Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman, all DC characters, they kept going. They were never canceled because they were all licensed and marketed and merchandised and super famous. So they were the only superheroes you could get in America, more or less. So Marvel did other things. Patsy Walker is a sort of, as you can see, is a comedy character aimed at girls. I've read some of these comics. They're really charming. They're not like Archie. They're different, but they're kind of the same vibe. Patsy Walker, they actually revive her, or they bring her into the superhero universe eventually, and she's on Jessica Jones, the Marvel Netflix TV show. If you recall, this is where Patsy Walker comes from. Kid Cult Outlaw, Western comics, absolutely huge. Westerns were huge. There was tons of Western shows and movies all the way through the 60s. And then the interest in that kind of died out because I guess the time frame got farther and farther away, maybe. But so Marvel was always doing whatever the trend was, Marvel would follow it. Where DC was more successful because they had these three giant characters, they were able to have a line of comics, also Westerns, also all kinds of things. And they were successful, and Marvel was not very successful. They were definitely third string. Here's an example of Joe Simon and Jack Kirby love romance comic. On the left is an original one from the, I think from the 50s. They kind of invented romance comics. I mean, of course, there were romance pulps and romance novels, but no one had ever done them in comics. So that's a Kirby cover. The stuff in the middle and on the right, that's DC Comics, because Kirby leaves Marvel in like 1970 and does a lot of things over there. And they wanted him to do a romance comic, but they wanted it to be aimed at African-American people. So you can see it's not penciled in, it says Soul Love. Unfortunately, this is also going to be a magazine style comic book, slightly bigger size and available in black and white art and racked with magazines rather than comic books, but it never actually happened. So there's a reprint of these stories he did do, and they're really amazing, actually. Again, sort of name checking Jack Kirby again, huge comic book creator. Also in the same period, EC Comics, educational comics originally, couldn't find a lot of traction with these sort of, tales of the, Emperor Constantine or whatever they were doing, educational comics. A great idea, but it was just not selling. And then when they created Tales from the Crypt and sci-fi companions and other horror comics, they became huge. Unfortunately, attracted bad attention. They were blamed for juvenile delinquency in a famous congressional hearing after a book called Seduction of the Innocent was published by a psychologist who basically blamed all juvenile delinquency on comic books. Comic books will rot your children's brains. And Tales from the Crypt is pretty edgy for the time, but you read it now, it's pretty tame. But it's a horror comics. It's nothing untoward. Anyway, they had to stop doing Tales from the Crypts and that kind of stuff. Mad Magazine survived this big controversy, and Mad Magazine, this is actually Mad the comic. Later it becomes the Mad Magazine. It's like slightly bigger size Mad Magazine. So this is the comic, but this is the first time kids and teenagers had their own pop cultural satire source. Right? I mean, satire has obviously always existed, but this is the first time the culture around them was being satirized in comics. You had funny things, but they were sort of like Patsy Walker. They were riffing on the idea of the 50s rather than the reality of the 50s. So Mad is sort of making fun of hypocrisy and all kinds of stuff. And it influenced a lot of kids who read Mad Magazine went on to be all kinds of writers, satirists, creators, and Mad Magazine was a massive influence on a lot of people. Here we have an example of a Mad strip called Super Duper Man. And it's the kids at the time had never seen something. Superman was a cultural institution. It was a big deal across media. And here was this magazine making fun of Superman. And it was, first time you get satire for young people. And Saturday Night Live is a sort of descendant of that kind of parody, where you're parodying pop culture. In the late 50s, there was an editor at DC Comics, which again has been doing very well with their big three, the Trinity, Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. But their comics sell well because those comics sell well and they get really good distribution. Where like a company like Marvel was always struggling, like I said, and imitating what was popular. So Julius Schwartz, as an editor, says, hey, we got this anthology title and we're launching some titles that are successful enough to have their own books. Let's bring back the Flash, but let's make a new Flash. So this is the first appearance of Barry Allen in this costume. The Golden Age Flash looks quite different and is a different character. You probably, if you know the Flash TV show, you've seen him. He has this sort of like pie crust tin on his head. That's what the joke was. It's like a hat. It's the god Hermes had this funky hat. The HTD florist has this hat. And obviously that kind of look wouldn't have gone over well in 1957, as compared to 1944. So this is a modern Flash, and it was a gigantic hit right away. He got a book very shortly after. They then did the same to Green Lantern, for example, who was just unrecognized. You would never pick the Golden Age Green Lantern and go, that's the Golden Age Green Lantern, because he looks nothing like the new Green Lantern, which some of you may know. Anyway, they modernized a lot of these characters that had been popular in the 40s and eventually started a team-up book. You can see another showcase book called Brave and the Bold, and Brave and the Bold would have short stories of different types. So they start up a sequel series to the Justice Society of America, where the 40s superheroes all getting together. Unfortunately, Wonder Woman was often the secretary and would just write things down instead of go and kick some butt. But times changed, and Wonder Woman became a tank throwing princess who doesn't need help from any guys and doesn't need to be the secretary eventually. So Brave and the Bold is where Justice League comes out. Justice League is a huge hit. And Justice League leads to an interesting conversation between the publisher of Marvel Comics, Martin Goodman, and Stan Lee, who is the one and only editor at Marvel. Marvel's just tiny. It's production people, Stan Lee, and a bunch of freelance pencilers. And Stan Lee kind of puts the dialogue over all these stories. And a little bit of controversy there we'll get to. So Martin Goodman says to Stan Lee, hey, that Justice League book is selling real well, Stan. I want a superhero book at Marvel. Get it done. So Stan gets his marching orders from Martin. He was actually related to him by marriage. So it's a little bit of a Nepo baby is our Stan. So Stan goes to Jack Kirby. Again, we've seen him create the creator of Romance Comics with Joe Simon, the co-creator with Joe Simon of Captain America. Kirby has been working for DC, and then he's back at Marvel, and he turns to Jack Kirby to create a new book, of a superhero book. So here's Jack Kirby's story. We have both. These are both from the library. Jack Kirby, The Epic Life of King of Comics, which I highly recommend. It's beautiful and inspiring, also heartbreaking, because Jack Kirby really gets a raw deal from Marvel and from the comics industry in general. And he creates so much stuff. It's hard to describe how influential Jack Kirby is. There would be no Star Wars without Jack Kirby. Let me put it that way. That'll be our next secret history, the secret history of Star Wars and Jack Kirby. King of Comics, also about Kirby. It's a prose book with art and also got some heartbreaking stuff in it, but also inspiring stuff because Kirby is awesome. So Stan, as Stan is turning to create a superhero book with Jack, Marvel's been doing a lot of monster comics were cool. So Jack Kirby is one of his many specialties at Marvel was all of these crazy Marvel comics. You can see Groot is in there. Groot is the monster from Planet X. Was just sort of forgotten about and then was revived in the 70s briefly. Also was a crazy, silly monster story. And then in the 21st century, he becomes a member of the Guardians of the Galaxy, which is another sort of a failed comic book. And they put in all these new characters and now everyone knows who Groot is, right? So Kirby did these monster comics. And as you see on the Fantastic Four, that is the comic that Lee and Kirby created in response to Justice League, as the legend goes. And you can see that it's very influenced by the monster comics. They don't have costumes in the first, I think, 2 or 3 issues. They're just these weird adventures with weird powers. You can see the Challengers of the Unknown. This is from when Kirby was working at DC. And this is actually the template for the Fantastic Four. The Challengers of the Unknown are 4 people who have these terrible accidents they all walk away from. And then they challenge the unknown together. And the Fantastic Four also have a terrible accident too, but they get superpowers. So the middle where you see Rocky with superpowers kind of prefigures the Human Torch, who's already been invented at Marvel under a different name. But you can see this idea, you see the connection between the Fantastic Four and the Challengers of the Unknown. And the Challengers had similar amazing sci-fi adventures as did the Fantastic Four. So they're kind of like cousins. Here we see the Submariner coming back finally after a long exile. And Captain America comes back in the Avengers. And you see Spider-Man over there. That's another anthology, like the monster. It's actually a monster comic that Steve Ditko did. And Steve Ditko is the co-creator of Spider-Man, although that's a Jack Kirby Spider-Man on the cover. And this was just a throwaway 10-page story in the last issue of this canceled magazine. And it was a huge hit. And Spider-Man got his own book. And the Marvel Age just sort of took off with all of these things happening in the space of 2 or 3 years. This is called a double-page spread, just giving you an idea of Kirby's dynamism. This is from the 40s. I'm a big Kirby fan, by the way, so this is a bit of a digression, but he is kind of important to comics, to say the very least. Here's something from the Hulk, which I thought was really cool, because like back then you could see all kinds of movies that were sci-fi, but I'm sure people were very convinced by the special effects at the time, but they weren't very good. You couldn't see something like this. This is a man getting pummeled by gamma rays from a bomb, and it's really striking imagery. And you couldn't really do this in sci-fi film. It's very costly. So comics, it's a good example of what comics can do. the sort of fantasy sci-fi superhero end. They can show you things that you can't see in other mediums. And people complain about special effects in superhero movies. Now, I don't really have a problem with them. I think they're cool. I concentrate on the story, but people are always whining about special effects. But the great thing about comics is you don't need $200 million to do a bunch of special effects. You just find a really cool artist and they can draw anything, right? And it's transformative. It's amazing. And it's not film. It's something different, obviously. And it's not prose. Comic books actually work on a different part of the brain than reading a text story, and they work on a different part of the brain than just watching a movie. They're a hybrid, but they actually function in a different way in a different area. And we have got a great book called Unflattening in the graphic novel section, which is about cognition and perception and comics, and it is a masterpiece. It's definitely like it's not something you read 10 minutes before going to sleep. It's a masterwork of what happens when we read comic books. Again, Unflattening. Check it out. It's amazing. Here we got some more Kirby covers. This beautiful cover. It's not a Marvel cover, Foxcell. I just always love this image of Kirby. You got Thor. Kirby's imagination begins to run riot, and he stops sort of doing 9 panels a page and goes down to 4 sometimes. And his style just explodes, and you get this weird dynamism, and he creates the Fantasy Four and Thor, just intensely visual. And I wish I could I probably will do a Kirby Secret History too. It's influences everything. There would be no Star Wars without Jack Kirby. He goes to DC after like 1970. He's angry because he's not getting paid properly to create stories. He's creating these stories, and then Stan Lee is putting the dialogue on them, and he's not getting any part of the writer's check, the writing check. Back like at DC, the writer is paid to write a full script, all the dialogue, all the captions, descriptions of every single panel, what happens in every panel, every page, and the artist just draws it. But at Marvel, when they were unsuccessful, they couldn't do that. Stan Lee didn't want to hire writers because they didn't have much money. So he would just have these really general conversations with writers. And luckily enough, he had people like Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko working for him. And they would just do the stories, and Stan Lee would put they would be based on very simple ideas. Like there's a famous Fantastic Four story where Galactus comes to Earth to eat the Earth. He's like this giant, weird Kirby sci-fi god, cosmic god. And, the pitch was, what if Fantastic Four met God? And Galactus is not God. He's sort of godlike. And Kirby did the whole thing. And that's writing, but he didn't get paid for writing that issue. He even throws in the Silver Surfer, and Stan Lee gets the pages and goes, "Who's this guy?" And he goes, "I thought a cosmic god should have a herald. He's called the Silver Surfer." So, Stan Lee, bless him, as a great huckster, and writes a lot of powerful dialogue, but he really did not treat Kirby well, or Ditko, and they left. And Ditko created Doctor Strange himself and co-created Spider-Man. And the Forever People are from Kirby's trip over to DC, where he creates a whole bunch of books and characters which are still being published. That's one thing about Stan Lee. He didn't really create anything of value after Ditko. And Kirby left. So it's kind of a bit of a indication of where the true creative power was, or the balance of it was anyway. Here's a double page spread from the Eternals, which came out in the 70s, and it blew my mind when I was 10 years old, this concept of incredibly powerful aliens who've affected our evolution and returned to Earth. Of course, the Marvel movie came out. Just an example of his dynamism and creativity. And that digression is now over. Meanwhile, while the Flash and Marvel comics are happening, and all different comics, the underground comics happen. You got civil rights is happening. People are protesting the Vietnam War. Culture is changing. Rock and roll and pop are mutating, and fashions are changing, and the young people are changing, and they're beginning to rebel against this sort of very square version of reality. The 50s, and they're acknowledging these sort of power imbalances and all kinds of things, and women's rights, ecological rights. Everything is happening, but art is particularly fertile, and so you get these comics coming out of nowhere, just independent presses like Zap, which was originally created by R. Crumb, and later a bunch of other young artists joined him, and the Freak Brothers are kind of like hippies, but the Three Stooges, still going on. Still around, actually. Amazing stuff. And again, independently published. In the 70s and 80s, these are sort of independent magazines or follow on from the underground. Love and Rockets is Jaime Hernandez and his brother Gilberto Beto. Jaime does these two characters who are my age. So when I started reading Love and Rockets, I was like 18, and now Maggie and Hopi, his characters, that's Hopi over there on the left, the sort of goth hair. They're in their 50s. It's kind of interesting to see characters age in real time. Elf Quest is by Wendy Pini. She is this comic is mind-blowingly good. She did it all on her own. Love and Rockets is published through a publishing company. And they're separated a little bit in time, but Wendy Pini, there were no women in comics, very few, and certainly no creators at this level of owning, writing and drawing their own strip. And she did it, and the painting is good, but the art inside is gorgeous. And we have Elf Quest collections from this era and later eras in our collection. She's kind of an unsung hero. I mean, she's obviously, Elf Quest has been very successful for a long time. It's never quite crossed over into other media, but it will eventually. But she was just a genius from the word go. I mean, sometimes you see people doing indie comics and they evolve a little bit, they get better, but she was a maestro from the beginning. On the right side, you see Lone Wolf and Cub, which is a US reprint and translation of a Japanese comic book, which I think was from the 60s. So that's the man. And this is where the Mandalorian is riffing on this, actually, with Grogu and the soldier Mandalorian. This is this samurai and his child. And he's always just kind of wandering the country, righting wrongs and wheeling a baby cart around. So this is where manga, Japanese comics, comes into the fore, and is reprinted. And there may be other reprints, but Frank Miller, who does the cover here, he used manga influences in his run on Daredevil, which was very influential. And so he got the power, I think, to say, hey, you should reprint Lone Wolf and Cub, and I'll do covers, because he was a superstar at the time. So he did the covers for years. So I assume that helped the project, and again, helped introduce manga. So this is the independents. These are smaller companies, or in Wendy Pini's case, a self-published and self-distributed comic. Not everything is, of course, zombies and capes and rockets and stuff. You've got all kinds of comics about different things. So where do graphic novels come from? Well, graphic novels is a term that nobody likes, but no one's ever been able to give there's been other terms for it, but they don't catch on, whatever. It's just one of those things. It'll always be called graphic novels. People have tried to change the title. So this is an early example. It's a paperback book. Gil Kane is the artist, wonderful artist. He actually was he's the designer of the Silver Age revival of the Green Lantern, amongst many, many, many other amazing things. So here we have an example of comic book art with dialogue, but it's also text-based. Right. So, graphic novel, it sort of makes sense. I don't know if they were calling this. You can see that this is supposed to be a series, but it did not do well. And I don't think they did more than one, which is unfortunate. So it's kind of a first effort at something different and in a different distribution system. So this would have been in bookstores and not on newsstands. Comics were only sold at newsstands and drugstores at the time. So this is the early 70s. This is 71. 76 and 77, 78, you get Richard Corbin adapting a Robert E. Howard story. Corbin came out of the underground comic scene. You got Saber, which is a futuristic sci-fi adventure. It's a little post-apocalypse, but not hardcore, I don't think, like Mad Max. I forget. But that's by two artists, a writer and artist who had developed at Marvel, I think, definitely. Paul Gulacy was an early illustrator of Shang-Chi's ventures at Marvel, and Don McGregor wrote a very famous run on Black Panther, which created a lot of the Black Panther lore, the early Black Panther lore. And then Black Panther is, of course, created by Jack Kirby with the assistance of Stan Lee. So anyway, these things were not big hits, but they were only available in comic book shops for the most part, I think. I don't think the Corbin book was mass market publications. But again, these have the a good claim to being early graphic novels. Here we have what everyone considers to be the first graphic novel, but it's not, but it doesn't matter. They're all amazing. This is particularly amazing. Will Eisner created The Spirit, which is a newspaper comic book. It was a comic book that was available in newspapers. So the format was gigantic. Like Spirit pages were the size of an entire newspaper page. And it was like an insert with a bunch of, sort of similar characters. The Spirit's just a guy with a domino mask who solves crimes, but not really a superhero. In fact, Eisner just reluctantly put a mask on him because suddenly superheroes have become popular, and the people he was syndicating The Spirit and these other strips to wanted a superhero. So he sort of invents a lot of the language of Western comics. It's kind of like the Orson Welles making Citizen Kane of comic books. He goes off to war. Actually, it's a bit of a digression again, and he does comics for GIs, training manuals in comic book form, because they realized, I think Eisner pitched this, he said, I think these kids, because most of the GIs were young, are going to respond better to a comic book about how to repair a Jeep than a manual. And this was true. And the PS magazine was the name, I think, it was only published within the Army Armed Services, but Eisner pioneered this idea that you could use comics to educate people. And, eventually this is manifest in different ways much, much later, but he was way ahead of the curve. He comes back from the war, and that's when he does his amazing work on The Spirits. We do have some of his work in the library. And in the 70s, he tells a story about his youth. Well, it's not about his youth, but it's about people. It's set in the era when he was young. So it's set in the 30s in tenements on the East Side, big Jewish neighborhood. And these are three sort of, they're not quite interconnected stories, but they're thematically connected, and they're united by time and place. And it's fantastic. We do have it in the library. And I think I might bring in some more of this Eisner work, because he did a lot of stuff depicting this time. And it's a really very personal and amazing and beautifully wrought, window into the 30s and other cultures and other experiences. It's all amazing stuff. This is about the main story is about a guy I think he's a rabbi, and his daughter dies, and he feels like, that God has broken his contract with him because he's a rabbi and he's a man of faith, and he has a crisis of faith. He doesn't know how to deal with his grief. And I don't remember what the other stories are, but they are set in, as you can see, tenements. So amazing stuff. Here's a later edition of the book that sort of takes panels and sort of uses them as chapter breaks, I believe. Just a wonderful, wonderful artist. And his body language, as you can see, is very expressive. He's a master. So they were graphic novels, but they were kind of like these weird things that just sort of happened. There was no traction. No one said, hey, let's do this as a business model. Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons do an amazing comic book series at DC. It's very dark. It's a sort of revision of superheroes, sort of postmodern, like, well, what would these people be like in the real world? Like, who would dress up in leather clothes and beat people up, for shoplifting? That would be kind of interesting to explore. So that was the whole idea behind Watchmen. And it was massive. Moore was already a superstar. He's English, and he'd always sort of revolutionized comics and made them more adult and sophisticated. And Watchmen was an example that got, as you can see from the cover, it won the Hugo Award, which is one of the major sci-fi awards. Very controversial, I think, at the time, because they're like, this is a comic book, and people are like, no, it's 12 issues, it's a 12-issue story, it's a novel, touch some grass, guys. It's a masterwork. And so it won the Hugo. And famously, Moore and Gibbons signed a contract that said when the book goes out of print, they would receive ownership rights, and they could do what they wanted with it. They could reprint it how they saw fit. At the time, this would be like 1984, 5. At the time, the idea that a graphic novel would be in print almost 40 years later, if you had said that, people would have laughed at you, because there was no graphic novel market. There were just the odd thing here and there. And this was obviously something that was very successful. They actually probably had a really bad lawyer, I think, because any sort of good publication lawyer would say, well, technically they could keep it in print forever and you'd never get the rights to the character. So it created a bit of a problem with Moore, and he left DC for a number of other reasons. But it's an amazing work. We have it in the library, and it's an example of a very, it's example key graphic novel. And this is when graphic novels sort of starts to enter the popular culture, because it's written about in magazines and much talked about. People do this article, and they all had similar subtitles. Comics aren't just for kids anymore. And they'd point to Watchmen. They'd also point to Mouse. So Mouse starts in the undergrounds in the 70s. Art Spiegelman does a version of it. Then he reframes it, and he does it in this weird punk art avant-garde magazine in the 80s, serializes it. And then when he finishes it, he publishes it as a graphic novel, and it wins the Pulitzer Prize. And it is astonishing work. It is the greatest graphic novel in Western culture, bar none. And it is about Art Spiegelman. It's a fictional biography. So he is visiting his father, and his father survived the death camps in World War II. And his father is sort of this interesting character, and he's a bit difficult. And of course, he's had this difficult experience, this trauma. And Art Spiegelman is sort of trying to get his story down and kind of come to terms with him, because the character, his fictional avatar has a difficult relationship. He wants to understand his dad. So they flash back to the past, and the words fail. It's gorgeous. It's disturbing. He hit on an interesting concept where he draws the Jewish characters with mice heads, and the Nazis are all cats and whatever. Sounds kind of goofy, but when you see it, the way that his style is very simple and very evolved and cool, and it actually makes total sense. And it is just genius. On the right, we see The Best We Could Do. This was an amazing graphic novel. As you can see, National Book Critics Circle Award winner. This is a big hit about 4 years ago, and we have it in the library. And this is the big and. We're starting a graphic novel book club, and this is the first selection. So by the time this comes out, it may have happened, but there'll be a book club. So check it out. Go to our library website, altadinalibrary.org, and look on the schedule for graphic novel book club, or just Google graphic novel book club, Altadena Library, and you should find the information for the first one. And this is an example. This is a story about immigrants. And this was published by a major publisher. So it didn't come out as comic books. This is, again, the fruition of graphic novels that we've been talking about, is this kind of graphic novel, which now publishers see that, well, look at Mouse, or look at Best We Could Do. We can do graphic novels. We can have imprints. Publishers can do imprints, and we don't have to do superheroes, because other people do superheroes perfectly well. We don't have to do science fiction. We don't have to do this sort of thing that people think of as comic books. And for a long time, they thought comic books are for kids. They're all about superheroes. The publishers all realized, hey, we can publish wonderful autobiographical fiction, nonfiction. We can publish anything. We can publish, fiction that reads like a novel. There's comics is infinite, and of course all the artists have different styles, and the writers have different styles, and some of them are writer artists, and it's become so fertile, and it's finally become sort of totally autonomous. And it started in the 80s. In the 80s, these articles about comics aren't just for kids anymore would point to sort of 11 Rockets, Watchmen, Mouse, and a few other examples, but then there weren't really many other things to point to. They would say, oh, this run on the Hulk is really good, but there was no reprints of that run on the Hulk, because they weren't doing graphic novel collections then. They were all evolving. Neil Gaiman helped with The Sandman. This is an amazing comic about dreams and myths and gods, and that was an instant hit, and that really kind of took it from the boiling point. And that's when they started reprinting The Sandman as soon as they'd done 6 issues and the next 6 issues. And that's when, things were already happening with graphic novels from DC, but that's when the idea finally begins to sort of enter the mainstream culture, and people are looking for a Sandman at the bookstore, and we're off to the races. So the whole of the 80s, it's evolving. It's really just one sort of story. At the end of the day, it's comic books, right? It's comics. So the kids are all right. It's our final panel. You will see Bone. That is the original comic book, I believe. So Jeff Smith did Bone as a black and white comic for years. It's an indie comic in the tradition of 11 Rockets, in the tradition of ElfQuest. I think he self-published it, and it was very well regarded. I never picked it up, and I don't know why. I would look at it and think, oh, this looks really cool, but maybe not my thing, maybe later. And I never read it until I had a child. She wanted to read it. And that's what happened is nobody knew what Bone was outside of the comic book industry, the comic book fandom. And what happened is Scholastic Books did a deal with him. And they said, hey, we'll do these in graphic novel form and you can color them. Would you like to color them? And he's probably said, oh, absolutely. So again, Bone is initially a black and white strip, but it was published by Scholastic and it was an instant sensation. And that paved the way for all of the comic books that if you're a parent, you know what they are. Raina Telgemeier, a master, started with the Babysitters Club adaptations and now is doing her own things. And she outsells DC Comics and Marvel Comics on her own. That's how gigantic kids comics are. And of course, Dogman, Captain Underpants. It's interesting because about 23 years ago, something like this, the novelist Michael Chabon gave a keynote address at the Eisner Awards, named for Will Eisner. It's the equivalent of the Oscars in comic books. It's the highest, one of the highest sort of things you can win, winning an Eisner. So he gives a keynote speech and he goes, hey, publishers, why don't you publish comics for kids? And Chabon then says, and the publisher was to say, well, you don't buy comics for kids. And Chabon says, how can we buy comics for kids if you don't make comics for kids? As he pointed out the circularity of this argument that seemed to be happening because Marvel and DC had sort of moved, initially aimed their stuff at kids, then adults kept reading them and college students read Marvel comics in the 60s. So the whole sort of demographics of comics reading changed, but they were aimed at children at the beginning. But eventually, the Marvel comics at the time in the 90s, they just too sophisticated for kids, and frankly, probably a little inappropriate in some ways, depending on what your ideas are about what kids can and can't read, and everyone's ideas are different. So what happened was, I don't think it was because of Michael Chabon, but certainly things changed, and with Bone, you get kids comics, and they go nuts, and also the success of all the Bone and Telgemeier, that also helped give publishers the confidence to publish graphic novels themselves. And so we have a great rich culture now of comic books in the West. Of course, comic books exist in every culture, and almost every culture anyway, so there's lots of stuff happening all over the world, always has been. We actually separated our graphic novels out in the adult collection. We have a biographical section, and we have a section of nonfiction, and then we have the sections for all the sort of fiction, most of it which is Batman and Walking Dead and all kinds of amazingly imaginative stuff that you've never heard of. You can ask for a recommendation from me if I'm there, or you can write to me if you want recommendations. But we have the nonfiction section. It's because I realized, and many people have realized this in libraries, that people who are maybe interested in things like Mouse or The Best We Could Do, they may know that book, but then they're looking for other similar books, and they're looking in the graphic novel section. You can't really pick them out. You sort of can, obviously, by title, but it was difficult. So libraries started separating out the sort of indie stuff, so that people who aren't interested in zombies and ray guns and superheroes could browse more easily and not get cricks in their neck looking through the entire collection. So anyway, that's the way our adult collection works. Oops, I've gone the wrong way. Do come and see us. We have a great graphic novel collection. We have a great teen graphic novel collection. We have a great kids Youth and Family Services graphic novel collection. And honestly, I got to say, we have a great collection, period, of everything: books, magazines, movies, games, the library of things, you name it. It's a really amazing collection, and it's a beautiful library. And if you have not visited, you should visit if you're in the neighborhood. And if you're nearby, you don't have to have you don't have to be a resident of Altadena to get a library card. So come in and check it out, and keep reading comics, and check out the Altadena Library Graphic Novel Club. So thank you for listening.